Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are plunging into a subject that's really fundamental to who we are. It's all about the psychology of groups.
Yeah, it's a huge topic, and you've shared some fantastic sources really digging into why we form groups, how we change within them, and how, these group settings affect everything from our behavior to power dynamics.
Absolutely. So, our mission today is to unpack all of that, pull out the key insights, and give you a clearer picture of the forces at play whenever people get together. Could be just two people, could be millions.
And we'll see how groups can bring out the very best in us.
And sometimes, yeah, frankly, the worst. Let's dive in.
Okay, so first things first, what do the sources actually mean by a group? At its core, it's pretty simple.
Right. It's basically just two or more people doing something together, usually with some common interest or goal.
Exactly, but as the sources point out, there's a whole spectrum here.
Yeah, like on one end, you've got strangers on a bus, barely a group at all.
And on the other end, you have these really cohesive units. Think sports teams, assembly lines, tight-knit communities, shared goals, lots of interaction, strong identity.
So why? Why is this tendency to group up so deep in us?
Well, the sources point to evolution first. I mean, it makes sense, right? Safety in numbers, finding food together, tackling tasks too big for one person. That's the basic foundation.
But here's where I think it gets really fascinating and where the sources say humans kind of leap ahead of other social animals.
Culture.
Exactly. Culture lets us organize in way more complex ways. We're not just hunting together, we're building things, publishing things, creating technologies.
Things that need information passed down,
Yeah.
specialized skills preserved over generations.
Yeah.
Culture lets us do that.
And it allows for really sophisticated role differentiation. It's not just everyone doing the same thing.
Precisely. It's different people doing totally different specialized things that all fit into a bigger picture, achieving much more complex goals together.
So understanding those basic drivers, the evolutionary push, plus our unique cultural abilities, that really sets the stage for everything else we'll talk about. It's the fundamental why of groups.
Okay, so moving on from the why to the how groups work, one of the most distinctive things about human groups, according to the sources, is this idea of defined roles and how flexible we are as individuals in taking them on.
This is so important. The sources emphasize complementary roles, like the classic village blacksmith and farmer example. They achieve more together because they do different things, right?
Yeah, human roles work within a larger system. It relies on others doing different necessary tasks.
And culture kind of creates these roles separate from the person. You can be a student, then a worker, then a parent. Yourself adapts.
Right, which raises a really interesting question the sources explore. What happens to that individual self when it gets, submerged in the group?
Because, counterintuitively maybe, the sources suggest that actually identifying individuals and holding them accountable often leads to better results for the group.
Exactly. And the flip side of that is this phenomenon they call deindividuation.
Ah, yes. The loss of self-awareness, loss of individual accountability, especially when you're in a crowd or feel anonymous.
And the key insight there is that this can unlock behaviors we wouldn't dream of doing alone. There's that quote.
No snowflake in an avalanche ever feels responsible.
That's the one. It captures it perfectly. When you feel anonymous, that personal responsibility just seems to dissolve.
And the sources give some really stark historical examples. They talk about how fascist movements, like Nazism specifically, deliberately submerged the individual for the good of the group, the Volk.
Which made tyranny and horrific acts much more likely because individuals felt less personally responsible for what the group was doing.
It's a chilling reminder of the dangers when that individual identity gets lost.
So let's shift from identity to something maybe even more subtle.
Yeah.
How just the presence of other people changes what we do.
Right. This brings us to social facilitation. And Zhang's theory, which the sources explain really well, the core idea is that having others around increases our physiological arousal. Like it just amps us up.
And this arousal makes us more likely to perform our dominant response, whatever's most automatic or practiced for us in that situation.
Okay, so here's the kicker. If it's an easy task, something you know well,
Your dominant responses usually do it right and quickly. So the audience helps. Think cyclists going faster together, or those cockroaches running a simple maze faster when others were watching.
right. But if the task is hard or new,
Then your dominant response might be to mess up. So having an audience can actually make you perform worse, like the amateur pianist playing a tough piece for the first time.
and the sources add another layer, evaluation apprehension. Worrying about being judged.
Yeah, that ramps up the arousal even more, especially if the audience seems judgmental. Although, interestingly, they mention narcissists might actually perform best when watched because they crave that admiration.
And get this, the sources even mention a study showing group presence influencing eating habits, like binge eating spreading in sororities, possibly linked to conforming to group norms or wanting to fit in.
It just shows how pervasive group influence can be, even on seemingly private things.
Okay, so presence can boost us or hinder us. Now, let's flip that coin.
Mm-hmm.
What about when being in a group makes people slack off?
Social loafing, the free rider problem.
Hmm.
The classic study here is Ringelmann's rope pulling experiment.
Yeah, tell us about that.
He found that when people pulled a rope together in a group, the total force was way less than if you just added up their individual pulling strengths. People literally pulled less hard together.
Wow, so the group wasn't even the sum of its parts. Why? Why does that happen?
Well, the sources suggest a couple things. Again, it's that feeling of being submerged, anonymous, and crucially, a lack of individual accountability. If no one can tell how hard you specifically are pulling.
It's easier to ease off a bit.
Exactly. Plus, there's the sucker effect. If you think others might be loafing, you don't want to be the one doing all the work, so you reduce your effort too.
The bad apple effect, they called it. One loafer can drag down the whole group.
Precisely. Which brings us back to identifying individuals. Ford's assembly line worked partly because each person had a clear, identifiable job. You could see who wasn't keeping up. That fights social loafing.
Ah, okay. So that helps explain the difference between facilitation and loafing. Triplet cyclists were competing, identifiable. Facilitation. Ringelmann's rope pullers were anonymous in their effort. Loafing.
Individual identification seems to be the key variable there. Accountability matters.
Okay, let's circle back to de-individuation for a moment and connect it to another big group challenge, managing shared resources.
Right. So de-individuation gets stronger with anonymity. Right. Feeling hidden in the crowd, also through contagion behavior spreading quickly and suggestibility, just being more likely to copy others.
And the insight from the sources is when you're de-individuated, you worry less about what outsiders think, and you're more likely to follow the immediate situation's norms, even if they clash with your usual morals.
The classic example is looting during a riot, people doing things they'd never do alone. The sources also mention gangsterism in places like the Cape Flats is a complex real-world example where group identity and maybe de-individuation play a role in violence, as individuals might feel less personally responsible.
And this links straight into the commons dilemma, the tragedy of the commons.
Yeah, the idea that shared resources often get depleted because everyone takes too much. Think overgrazing common land or overfishing the oceans.
It's that constant tension, isn't it, between doing what's best for the group long term versus taking what you can for yourself right now.
Exactly. The immediate personal gain just feels more real than the future collective cost. The sources say communication can help manage the commons, but often it's not enough. And that bad apple effect pops up again.
Yeah.
See someone else being greedy, you're more likely to copy them.
Which contrasts with private ownership, where there's usually more incentive to preserve the resource because you're directly accountable.
Right. Okay, so we've looked at how groups affect individual action. Now, how do groups think? Are two heads, or many heads, always better than one?
It's complicated based on the sources. On one hand, you have the wisdom of crowds.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Large groups can sometimes make incredibly accurate judgments, often better than any single expert inside the group.
Like Galton's bull guessing example, or the millionaire audience getting it right more often than the expert lifeline. But there's a huge if.
A huge if. It only works if the members are thinking independently and bring diverse information to the table. Without that diversity and independence, it falls apart.
Which makes the findings on brainstorming so interesting and kind of counterintuitive.
Totally. People like brainstorming sessions, they feel productive. But the research highlighted in the sources consistently shows that the same number of people working alone and then pooling ideas usually generate more ideas, and often better quality ideas.
So why does brainstorming together often lead to less?
Interaction can get in the way. You've got production blocking, waiting your turn to speak. Evaluation apprehension, maybe holding back a weird idea. Even a bit of social loafing can creep in.
Okay, but if it's less effective, why do we love teamwork so much? Why do companies push it?
Well, the sources suggest it's because teams meet fundamental human needs. They need to belong, to feel effective, to connect with others. Honestly, group work is often just more enjoyable, even if it's not always the peak of creative output compared to solo effort.
Makes sense. Okay, another way groups can be smart. transactive memory.
Ah, yes. This is how small, close-knit groups can become smarter together by basically dividing up who remembers what.
Like in a couple, one person remembers birthdays, the other remembers where the car keys are.
Exactly that. Or think back to the assembly line, each worker knowing their specific part of the process inside out. Effective groups develop a sense of who knows what, leveraging distributed knowledge rather than everyone needing to know everything. They specialize.
Okay, but group thinking isn't always wise. Let's talk about the dark side, groupthink.
Right. Groupthink. It's when the desire for harmony or conformity in a group leads to everyone thinking alike, often resulting in really poor decisions because dissenting views get suppressed.
And the sources lay out the conditions where this is more likely to happen. Very cohesive groups, isolation from outside views, a strong leader pushing a specific agenda, maybe high self-esteem leading to overconfidence.
And the symptoms are pretty clear. Pressure on dissenters to conform, an illusion that everyone agrees because people are censoring themselves, feeling invulnerable, feeling morally superior, underestimating opponents.
Committees seem especially prone to this. The sources mention that example of hiring someone.
Yeah, where the committee focused only on the information everyone already knew and ignored crucial, unique information that some individuals had about a better candidate just because it didn't fit the emerging consensus.
There was also that South African police service study mentioned, looking at how things like external respect affected committee decisions. It shows how the context really matters for whether these flawed processes take hold.
Absolutely. Context is key.
So, if groups tend to think alike, does discussion push them to the middle ground or somewhere else?
That leads to group polarization. And again, it's counterintuitive. Group discussion generally doesn't lead to moderation. It actually tends to push the group toward a more extreme version of whatever direction they were already leaning.
So if the group was initially a bit risky, they become more risky after talking.
Exactly. And if they were initially cautious, they become more cautious. It happens partly because we tend to talk with people who already agree with us, reinforcing our views and introducing new arguments for that side, pushing the whole group further out. It's like an echo chamber.
The opposite of the diversity needed for the wisdom of crowds.
Precisely.
All right, shifting gears again, let's talk about influence and control within groups, power and leadership.
Yeah, I mean, we might like the idea of equality, like in a marriage or democracy, but the sources point out that in practice, most groups pretty quickly develop leaders and hierarchies. It's often just more efficient. Think of an army, it needs clear ranks.
And the impact of leaders can be huge, right? The sources cite studies showing CEOs significantly affecting company performance, or the good to great finding that leadership was the key differentiator.
Absolutely massive impact. So what makes a good leader, according to these sources, they list things like humility, combined with extreme persistence. Henry Ford failing multiple times before the Model T is a great example here.
Also integrity, decisiveness, competence, having a clear vision, and interestingly, being prone to guilt, which sounds odd, but is linked to feeling more responsible.
Right, and finding that balance with assertiveness. Not being a doormat, but not alienating people either. Nelson Mandela was mentioned as someone who seemed to exemplify that balance, commanding respect but also being democratic.
But then there's the other side, toxic leaders. The sources use Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe as a really stark, sobering example.
Yeah, it's a powerful illustration of how a leader, even when initially seen as a hero, can prioritize their own power over the country's welfare, leading to disaster.
And the sources highlight some traits of dangerous leaders. Indifference to suffering, intolerance of criticism, a grandiose sense of entitlement, sometimes projecting that onto the whole nation like Napoleon or Hitler, pursuing grand visions at immense human cost.
It really brings Lord Acton's quote to mind. Power tends to corrupt.
And absolute power corrupts absolutely. The sources really dig into how power changes the powerful. 5 key effects.
Okay, first, emotion. Simply put, power feels good. Powerful people tend to experience more positive emotions.
Second, attention. They focus more on rewards, opportunities, and less on constraints or problems. Power undermines caution, as the sources put it.
Third, relationships. Power can lead people to look down on others, underestimate them. That study about managers rating workers. And flattery doesn't help, it can shield them from reality. Though having high status alongside power might buffer some of this.
Fourth, the duplex mind. Powerful people rely more on automatic thinking, maybe lazy thinking, because they aren't challenged as much. People without power think more carefully, deliberately, because they have to.
And fifth, action. Power removes inhibitions. It makes people more likely to act, take charge, even in ways unrelated to their power, like taking more risks in blackjack or moving an annoying fan.
But, and this is crucial, the source's stress power isn't always corrupting in a selfish way. It boosts the tendency to act, but that action can be for the group's benefit, especially if the leader feels connected to their followers.
That's a vital distinction. The sources also note how the powerful often work to keep their power, sometimes even undermining talented subordinates unless they need to unite against an outside enemy.
And what about the followers? How does being without power affect people?
They pay way more attention to the powerful, trying to figure them out, anticipate their needs. They're more likely to try and keep the peace in conflicts.
And they adapt their own behavior, sometimes unconsciously, to what they think the powerful person expects. And that little detail about people with less money laughing more, it's quite striking.
It hints the complex ways we adjust. Finally, the sources bring in legitimizing myths. These are the stories or beliefs that justify why the people in power deserve to be there. Merit, fairness, tradition, whatever it is, maintaining that legitimacy is crucial.
And the hashtag Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa was mentioned as a real-world example of those myths being challenged, of demands for change in power structures, sometimes involving confrontation and violence. It shows these dynamics are always live.
Absolutely, it's never static.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground today, a real deep dive. We started with the very basics, why groups form, evolution, the unique role of human culture.
Yeah, then how groups change us as individuals. Social facilitation being watched, making us better or worse. De-individuation, losing ourselves in the crowd. Social loafing, slacking off together. And the tragedy of the commons.
We looked at group intelligence, the potential wisdom of crowds needing diversity, but also the pitfalls of bad brainstorming, the dangers of groupthink's conformity, and how discussion can polarize opinions towards extremes.
And wrapped up with power and leadership. Their huge impact, the traits of good and bad leaders, the profound psychological effects of having power or not having it, and the constant need for legitimacy.
A recurring theme, it seems, is this tension. Group cohesion is good, specialization is good, but sometimes that means submerging the individual. Yet keeping individuals identified and accountable seems key to avoiding a lot of the downsides.
Exactly. And human culture, while enabling these incredibly powerful groups, has also developed things like laws and democratic systems to try and put checks on power, to manage these dynamics somewhat peacefully.
It's so clear that groups can amplify the best and the worst in us.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to take away from all this. Given how profoundly groups shape us, our actions, thoughts, sense of responsibility, what responsibility do you feel you have? Not just for how you act in your groups, but for choosing which groups you join and what kinds of norms you help establish or reinforce within them.
Something to think about as you navigate all the groups in your own life. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll catch you next time.